Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to do my usual wait for a second before I go any further and make sure that people are able to join in and, and take part. So welcome to this week's Learn With Lorna, and we're looking this week at the fantastic Wick Harbour Trust collection. Before I go any further, just would like to say welcome to everybody again. If you're not familiar with these series of talks, then my name is Lorna Steele, and I am the Community Engagement Officer at the Highland Archive Service. I'm laughing because Craig's comment has come in saying morning team, and every week I go morning team, because that's what I say at work, or is that a bit casual? So I'm delighted, Carolyn, that you have opened with morning team. Is there anyone watching from Ness this week? If you could say hello, that would be great. We're talking about Wick Harbour Trust and the records of that part of Ness. So it'd be nice if we knew if anyone was in Ness today. Before I go any further, I hope that some of you were able to take part in our Doors Open weekend. If you did, thank you so much. We had a fantastic weekend with a range of 10 or 12 different talks, interviews with different members of staff from across the Highland Archive Service. So I spoke with our conservators, archivists, registrars, all sorts of different people from across the 4 offices. And if you haven't had a chance to view those, then please do go back and have a look. They're available on our Facebook pages and also on our YouTube channel, the High Life Highland YouTube channel. Oh, excellent. Hi, Bill and Wick. Lovely. And Chris, yep, looking forward to this one as well. Fab. So yeah, as part of that Doors Open Day weekend, one of the members of staff I spoke with was Mckay, who is one of the archive assistants in Nucleus, in our Nuclear and Caithness archives. And so if you're able to have a look at that film, please do, because she talks about the building that this collection is held in and about some of her favourite items from within the Nucleus collections. As you'll know from the past series of these, what I'm trying to do is go round the offices, trying to pick some items from different collections so that these films get broadcast across all 4 of our Facebook pages. So it's nice to be able to pull different items from different collections. So we looked at the Cameron of Lochiel collection from Lochaber a few weeks ago. We looked at the Duncan Macpherson collection from Skye, the Inverness Borough records, and this week, the Wick Harbour Trust records. Before I go any further, just a reminder that this event is brought to you from High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there is no payment or subscription required to watch this or take part in this event. So please do remember that, although we are very grateful for any donations that people are able to make towards the work of the service. So, the Wick Harbour Trust collection. I'm going to tell some stories from within that collection and also some stories from about the harbour from other collections, because there are so many interesting stories. The collection is enormous. It dates from 1829 through to the 1990s, and it encompasses a huge range of different types of records, but I'll touch on that in a second. But first of all, a little bit about Wick Harbour itself. So I see there are people watching in Caithness, watching in Wick, who will be familiar with some of this information. But for those who are watching, I'm seeing people from Australia and different places. So Wick is up on the northeast coast of Scotland, so right up in the top right-hand corner as you're looking at the map. And for much of its history has been a very famous port, particularly notably a herring port. It now still has fishing boats going out from it, but is predominantly now commercial trade and leisure trade. It now has 3 basins, so it has the inner and outer harbours and also the river harbour. And all of those were constructed at different periods of time. Caithness, okay, I'll say that, Lily, Caithness. Yeah, so all of those different parts of the harbour constructed at different points in history. So obviously there's been a harbour there for many hundreds of years, but the official harbour as we know it now was started in 1803. It was extended in the 1820s, extended again several more times through its history and changed and developed. When it was started in 1803, it was under the British Fisheries Society, so they were the original people who organised the construction of the harbour. And it had many of the big civil engineering names from across the country involved in it. So Thomas Telford was involved in the original construction. Thomas Stevenson, who was Robert Louis Stevenson's father, a famous lighthouse and civil engineer, he was involved in the construction. And also at a later stage, James Bremner, who was a local Caithness architect. So from 1879 through to 2005, the harbour was owned and operated by the Wick Harbour Trust, and that came to being in the 1879 Pulteney Harbour Act. And as I say, gradually the fishing side of the port has declined and changed a little bit. There, at its peak, was hosting hundreds and hundreds of boats a day and catching many thousands of fish a day. But the harbour still continues, of course, and it continues with a range of different trade. And if you're interested in the timeline and the history of the harbour, then of course please do contact our team up at Nucleus. Wick Heritage have a lot of information, and of course the Wick Harbour Authority, who now run the harbour, also have a lot of information. They have a fantastic timeline on their website if you're interested in the story of the harbour. But what I'm going to do for the remainder of this talk is really pull out some of the stories from within the collections. The collection is very wide ranging, as with any business collection. It holds records to do with the running and establishment of a business, so there's legislative records, there are governance records, minutes, finance, things to do with correspondence, staff management, building management and repair, things like that. So the normal things you would expect to see from any business collection of the running of an organisation. But then, of course, there are records that are specific to the type of business that they're running. So there are the fantastic Harbour Masters logbooks, and that's where a lot of the stories I'm going to tell today are drawn from. There are registers of ships, registers of things that are brought in, so catches landed, fish landings, weigh-books, things like that, and a lot of info about equipment at the harbour, repairs to the harbour walls, and we will definitely come and talk about that in a second. So you start to see the range of the collection. As I say, it's very, very extensive. It's about 37 linear metres of collection, covering a wide range, a wide time period, but also a wide range of subjects of things that happened in the harbour. Some purely to do with the running of the business, and some to do with how that business impacted the local community and area. So the first story I want to talk about are the Wick grain riots. You'll see as we go through this that we're going to talk an awful lot about riots. So this particular story actually is not taken from the Wick Harbour Trust records, but we couldn't not include it because it's centred around the harbour, and it's such a fantastic, interesting, sad and dramatic story. So the context of this, the Wick grain riots happened in the 1840s. And the context is there's been several crop failures, successive crop failures, and a lot of starvation, a lot of hunger right across the Highlands. And if anyone is interested in this subject, then I would recommend Jim Hunter's book, Insurrection, Scotland's Famine Winter, which talks all about these food riots and often what's quite a forgotten part of Highland history. So there had been crop failures, starvation, a lot of people struggling in very difficult circumstances. But what was happening was, while the locals were starving, many of the landowners, and again this is round the country and round the north of Scotland, a lot of the landowners were still producing grain and shipping it out to be distributed and sold elsewhere. So other people were benefiting from local produce while people in the area were starving. As you can imagine, this is just an absolute tinderbox for emotions to run high, for people to be frustrated and angry. And so riots started, and as I say, they started right across different areas in the Highlands and right across different areas in Caithness. And it was in February 1847 that things really came to a head in Wick. The local community, a group of people, started to blockade the harbour so that the ships couldn't be loaded with these local supplies and be sent out elsewhere. And on the night of the 19th of February, it really started to kick off. There was news of a shipment that was going to be going out, and so the crowd blocked the harbour and prevented the ship from being loaded. In actual fact, they filled the ship that should have been loaded with stones and rocks to prevent them putting the grain onto it. As has happened several times through Wick's history, and we'll talk about some of these, the Riot Act was read, but the crowd stayed. And it's you will find through several of these stories there's a balance between a natural desire to see law and order kept and a sympathy for the situation people were in that made them feel this was their only option. There were hundreds of soldiers brought in from different places from Aberdeen, and an armed guard was stationed round the harbour while the ship was loaded. Oh, thank you. Good morning to everyone back at Wick Harbour Authority. Nice to have you with us. Yeah, so eventually the harbour, a guard was put up and the ship was loaded with grain. People stayed though, they kept rioting, and eventually, which just seems so astonishing to our modern ears, the soldiers did a bayonet charge up the street to disperse the crowd. So they charged at the crowd with their bayonets out to try and clear the streets and get the ships loaded and out. 3 people were were arrested. And then while they were taken into jail, they were being marched through the streets to go to the jail. And the local people were so angry that this had happened that they were throwing stones down on the soldiers. And eventually the soldiers were told just to open fire on the community. And there were several injuries. But one of the saddest ones, one of the most serious ones, and this comes to us through our poor relief records, which you'll maybe have heard me talking about when I did Poor Relief Week. There's an application for relief from a young man called William Hogston, and he was a cooper, so he's a barrel maker, and he has to claim poor relief because he got caught in the crossfire of the troops firing, and his hand was shattered. And obviously, being a barrel maker, he needed the dexterity of his hands, and without that, his hand had to be amputated, and without that, he had no way of making a living and able to support his wife and his 5 children. And so he appears in our poor relief records being given around about 5 shillings a week to live on. So just a very interesting example of how the harbour was absolutely central to community and to what was happening. And it's indicative of what was happening in other areas across the Highlands. But that mass impact of the crop failure leading to those riots, and then leading to people like William having a very personal impact on their life where they then can't survive. So that was 1847. 1848, so we're only 1 year later, and another massive tragedy and crisis hits. And this, if the people watching in Caithness will maybe be familiar with Black Saturday. This was the night of 18th into 19th of August 1848. By now, there are hundreds of ships operating in and out of the harbour every day. It's a very, very busy port. And they go out to sea in this day in August, what would have seemed at the time to have been a fairly normal day. And they put out to sea and were fishing. But as they were out to sea, a storm started to blow up. The storm at its peak coincided with a very low tide. And so the boats tried to get back in because they were obviously aware that they didn't want to be out in the storm. They were trying to get back into a safe harbour. But what happened was some of them made it, but many of them got caught as they tried to get back into the harbour. They got caught with a very, very low tide. And so of the boats that went out, and we don't know exactly, of course, how many boats went out that day, but of the boats that went, some 18 local boats were smashed on their way back in, so either sunk or smashed on the rocks as they tried to run back into the harbour. I say 18 local boats, there were 30 boats overall that were lost. And it was believed that, I'm just going to check my figures so I get it right, 94 men were lost overall on Black Saturday. 37 of them were Wick locals, so from Wick or the very near surrounding area. And they left 17 widows and 63 children. Now, those of you who are familiar with fishing communities will know that this is it has always been a part of the history of any fishing community that this is a danger. But it's so difficult to imagine the scale of loss on a community the size of Wick and Poultneytown at the time, that 63 of the children suddenly had lost their fathers. There's a fantastic picture, a painting by Robert Anderson of Black Saturday. It hangs in Wick, but it's also available to have a look at on Ambala, our website, if you're able to log on and have a look at that. And it just shows the devastation and the crashing waves. And we'll come on in a second to talk about the development of the Breakwater and why those waves in Wick were so particularly high and devastating. The good thing about this, and if you were looking at my comments this morning on Facebook, you'll see that I had said these are stories of riots and tragedy and loss of life, but they are also stories of innovation and development and change. And so there was an inquiry that was run after Black Saturday, and it found that if the boats had stayed at sea, they would have had more chance of survival, because at the time the condition of the harbour was such that it wasn't able to cope with the ships coming in during a storm at a low tide. And so huge changes came about as a result of Black Saturday. The harbour was deepened, and it was interesting when I was looking at the Wick Harbour Authority to see that work still is ongoing for deepening the harbour, changing it, adapting to what needs to be done all the time. And so as a result of Black Saturday, the harbour was deepened so that the low tide wouldn't have such an effect. There was a radical change in boat design, because up until that point it was believed that the type of boats operating out of Wick didn't stand much of a chance of survival in a storm like that, and so the design of boats were changed as a result of this. And also there was a huge change in equipment, so there was more rescue equipment put at harbours, and one notable thing was the installing of barometers in every harbour in Scotland as a direct result of what happened in Caithness that day. So although the tragedy absolutely can't be overstated and the loss of life was devastating, it's important to realise that sometimes out of those tragedies can come innovations and developments and learning experiences, and we'll talk about that in a second with the harbour, the Breakwater, which I'm just about to go on and talk about. So that's the 1840s. By the 1860s, as a direct result really of that storm and other storms where it was seen that the harbour wasn't suitably protected to look at, it wasn't safe enough, it wasn't a safe haven harbour to look after the ships that were coming in, they weren't protected enough, that there was decided to install a breakwater. So obviously you'll be familiar with the breakwater, a long piece of masonry or rubble that's put out into the water to protect the storm surges. And I'm sure that if I have worded that slightly wrong, someone from the Wick Harbour Authority will correct that. And it was Thomas Stevenson, and again, father of Robert Louis Stevenson, who was charged with the design of the breakwater for Wick Harbour. It's a really interesting story, the breakwater. He had designed, he had done a calculation that worked out what the height was needed of a breakwater, what was needed with the height of a wave and the fetch of the wave, so how far it reached forwards. And he calculated from that what he thought the breakwater design should be. And it was quite innovative. So the construction started in 1863, of the breakwater, he felt that there needed to be a north and a south breakwater and a safe channel in the middle for the ships to come in. It obviously took many years to construct, and it was around about 9 metres deep, about 15 metres wide, and it was made of a rubble base with blocks of stone on the tops with tons and tons of weight. But by 1870, that was 1863 it was started. 1870, so only a few years later, much of it was destroyed in a storm. There were extensive repairs and additions of concrete blocks and trying to strengthen it, trying to change the structure of it. But by 1872, again, a huge storm destroyed large swathes of it. Foundations were destroyed. The concrete topping that had been put on it was ripped away. And I'd like to read to you an extract from the Harbour Master's logbook from that date. This is 18th of December 1872. And he says, "The sea was never seen running higher in Wick Bay. Many spectators watching the action and results of each succeeding wave on the new harbour works, and as every wave threatened to engulf the whole structure. Stones of 5-ton weight were being tossed up from the back onto the platform, and the next sea carried them into the basin of the harbour. The very shore was trembling by the vibrations. At 11:30, signs were but too evident that the works were yielding to the dreadful pressure. As the waves receded, openings could be seen between the rubble work and the concrete. The gale continues unabated, and the roar of the waves is quite deafening." And then the next morning he says the extent of damages sustained at the new harbour works can now be better estimated, although the storm is nothing abated. Yet it can be seen that about 50 feet or more of the last finished portion is overturned to the low water mark. And the immense concrete block of not less than 800 tons has been carried bodily into the basin. So he says, complete destruction has hit, but he does go on to say that the underlying work, it should work. He's saying that there is strength there, and a certain amount of it is surviving, but that the strength of these waves is causing huge destruction. Again, there are some repairs carried out, but then in 1877, another storm wiped away the entire end of the breakwater, and it's estimated that 2,640 tons of concrete were destroyed and ripped away. And eventually in 1877, the whole project was abandoned, and it had cost around about £132,000 for this 10 or so year period where they had just tried to get it right. And again, so I'll read you a quote from Robert Louis Stevenson's book, In Memories and Portraits, because he says, "Wick Breakwater, the chief disaster of my father's life, was a failure. The sea proved too strong for man's arts, and after experience hitherto unthought of, and on a scale hypercyclopean, the work must be destroyed, and now stands as a ruin in that bleak, God-forsaken bay." So he says for all the successes of his father's life as a civil engineer, that kind of stood as a memorial to the fact that sometimes nature can be stronger. But again, I think it's really important to note what had gone wrong with this was that he had calculated, if you remember I spoke about the calculation that Stevenson had made, calculating the height of the wave with the fetch of the wave to work out how high the structure should be. He'd calculated it on a wave that was typical elsewhere, but didn't take into account the height and strength of the waves in Wick Harbour particularly. And so again, that became a lesson for future civil engineers of how to calculate particular to the area you're looking at. And just because that height of wave had not been seen anywhere else doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And so again, all of those things were used as learning curves for future generations of engineers. And in the 1880s, an engineer called James Barron successfully built a breakwater. There were some breaches over the years, but by and large, it was a very successful breakwater. And certainly made up for the issues that had been caused by Stevenson's. I've got two last stories to tell you, so I will try and hurry up. But before I do so, just a reminder that this live cast is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. And High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no subscription or payment required to take part in the Learn With Lorna series of events, although donations are appreciated if you are in a position to be able to do so. So the final stories, if anyone in Wick is watching, they'll be expecting the War of the Orange, and I have made sure the War of the Orange is represented. And this is from August 1859. This is at the height of the herring trade, so there are, I think, something like 800 boats, around about that, in every day. The harbour was very, very busy, and it was on a slightly small scale. It was a melting pot of all sorts of different people from all across the area. And tensions were running very high. There was competition for trade. There was a lot of people in the area. And the War of the Orange. Oh, sorry, yes, I'm just going to stop in for a second. Yes, Kathy. Jim Hunter is the name of the author. And the title of the book is Insurrection, Scotland's Famine Winter. And it is a really interesting book. Yeah, so the War of the Orange is a fantastic title, came about through something very small and escalated into something very big. So it was on the Saturday, the 27th of August, 1859. There were a couple of people, two men, one local young man aged 14 and another man, who started a fight over who was entitled to the last orange in the market. That's how it starts. But then don't so many arguments start with something that small. And so there was this argument about who should have this last fight. Again, it's a tinderbox situation. People are running at high tensions. There's a lot of different people there. Frustrations are high, and it escalated into a wider fight in the market. More and more people getting involved as the fight gathered momentum. And eventually there were about 300 people involved in this fighting in the streets, brawling in the marketplace. The police arrested a man called Robert McDonald from Lewis, who they said was the ringleader. And the crowd were furious that Robert McDonald had been arrested. So as he got taken in to the courthouse, there was the rioting carried on. People were getting more and more frustrated. And then Donald McKenzie, who was another Lewis man who was there, he and his crew were so incensed that Robert McDonald had been arrested that they went to their ship, took the mast down, and used it as a battering ram to batter the courthouse to try and get Robert McDonald back out. In the evening, Reverend Mckay, who was from Tongue Parish, he came out and spoke to the crowd, and he tried to tell them to go home, to calm down, and some of them did, and many of them did not. And again, the Riot Act was read. And so the Wick Harbour Muster's logbook reads like this: a serious riot in Bridge Street, Wick, the town besieged by Highlanders. The Riot Act read and constables sworn in, which had the effect only of irritating the infuriated men, many of the thoughtless young lads in the place furnished with batons. Magistrate is taking every precaution to protect the inhabitants. Now, what I find particularly interesting about this, and if any of you were watching on Jacobite Week, a similar thing is found there, that these locals in Wick are talking about the Highlanders as something other. They don't see themselves as part of that grouping of people. So the Highlanders are somebody else. In Nairnborough Minutes in the 1600s, they talk about an infestation of Highlanders. And here they talk about being besieged by the Highlanders. So it's a very clear cultural divide within the Highlands about the people who kind of associate with the Gaels and the people who don't. And I think that's really, really interesting. So this was Saturday. The minister, as I say, spoke to the crowd, tried to calm them down, and to some extent they did. And Sunday, the harbour master says the greatest decorum was observed. And that, of course, is because it's the Sabbath. So the community are trying to not overact on the Sabbath. They're trying to be respectful to it. But any feeling that this had kind of eased and ended is not true, because on Monday morning, immediately they regrouped, and the harbour master reads, rioting began this morning at 9:30 a.m. Numbers of Highlanders thronging Bridge Street and threatening vengeance against the parties using batons on Saturday evening. Numbers were maltreated in High Street and Bridge Street, Wick, in the forepart of the day. The mob thereafter concentrating in great numbers in the Shore Street and MacArthur Street, Pulteney Town, in the afternoon. Upwards of 22 persons struck and abused before 6 p.m. No available force able in any way to check the violence offered. In order to kind of try to diffuse the situation, they released the prisoners they'd taken, and they released Robert McDonald, the Lewis man. The army reservists were called in, special constables were sworn in, and by the 31st of August, there were 270 special constables carrying out 13 patrols around the harbour and the town. And on the 2nd of September, these numbers were augmented by 100 soldiers from the West Yorkshire militia who arrived by sea and were pulled in to try and support the authority in the town. The extracts over the next few days for the Harbour Master's logbooks say that there is rioting of a very serious kind. People are brandishing wives, dear me, brandishing their knives and their weapons, and that there was a huge risk of many people being mortally wounded. They attempt, after things start to quell this gradually over time, the locals were so horrified by what had happened in the town that they gave up their weapons. Gradually the boats leave, the boats go back to Lewis and other parts of the Highlands, and the tension starts to drop. There was an attempt to rearrest Robert McDonald, but he escaped, and by all accounts escaped, and on the road out of Caithness he overrun a carriage who didn't pick him up, pushed him out to the side and took the carriage and got back to Lewis, where he was rearrested, but apparently later on escaped again. So gradually, as I say, the tensions kind of diffused, and by the 14th of September, the patrols had stopped and the situation had calmed again. But it's interesting to me that that's just one example of things that are happening all around the country. There's inequality, there's tensions, there's people are hungry, people are fighting for their livelihoods. And so the last one I wanted to tell you about kind of links into that, and this is from the 1880s, and this is the Trawler Riots of 1885. There had been gradually an increase in trawler fishing. So of course, trawler fishing is dragging a net along the bottom of the sea. It can produce a very substantial catch, but it can cause damage to the bottom of the sea and can capture fish that are immature and not yet ready to be taken in. And so in 1883, it starts to be noted more and more that trawlers who are looking for new supplies and new catches are trawling the Caithness coast, and they're causing damage and they're taking away from local fishermen's trade. So they're taking the stocks and they're causing damage to the local tradition of line fishing. And so by the 3rd of April 1884, a meeting was called in Leicester to discuss what was going to be done about this. And so it was fishermen, local fishermen who attended, curers from the herring industry, and representatives from the churches, because their frustration was that the trawlermen were fishing on Sundays and that this was not appropriate. And there's a question as to whether how much the fishermen were really bothered by the Sunday thing, or if they were just going, right, you're an ally, yep, we agree with you, Sundays as well. Not sure. And again, the tensions between the trawlermen and the local fishermen escalated. There was an occasion in 1885 where the trawlermen, there were several ships came in, several trawlers came in and were stoned. So local youths threw stones at the fish, at the trawlermen, to try and get them to not be able to unload their catches. There was legislation passed around fishing, but some of these pieces of legislation exempted trawlers, and that obviously caused frustration as well. And so I want to read to you from the Wick Harbour Masters Trust records again, as the Harbour Masters logbooks, which are just fantastic. My colleague Jamie, as we were talking about this, said they are so beautifully written, and I was reading them again this morning. I thought they really are beautifully written. So March 1885, this starts to come to a head, and the line fishermen had several unsuccessful days of fishing, and they claimed that this was due to all the trawlers who were taking their catches away and taking their lines away. And so the Harbour Master's logbook for this date reads, "Great excitement prevails about the harbour today. The steam trawler Royal Duke arrived with about 30 pounds worth of fish and proceeded to land them at the North Quay. As this was proceeding, a great number of fishermen gathered about, determined not to allow the fish to be sold or to boycott the buyers who tried. Mr. John Munro proceeded to rout the fish, so to auction the fish, in the midst of a great uproar, and while in the act of doing so, he was mobbed and run up the quay by angry crowds of fishermen. The rest of the fishermen taking the fish and throwing the boxes and everything into the harbour. The buyers were also badly used, one of them being badly cut. 2 of the trawlers hoisted their ensigns and the Coast Guard and police arrived. Later on, the trawler Miss Roberts arrived and was met by a howling mob with stones." So he goes on to say the Miss Roberts arrived, the Dewdrop trawler arrived, and all of them were met by local fishermen throwing stones at them, preventing them from unloading their catches. Overnight this continued, so there was many stones thrown at these ships, and the crews of the trawlers hid inside them. And there's even one point where the harbour master said that even he was in danger because he tried to prevent this happening. He was in danger of being thrown in. He writes that in his logbook, that they threatened to throw him in the harbour. And one of the trawlers, the Dewdrop, eventually fired blank shots into the crowd to try and disperse them. Again, it's one of those interesting things, and we've seen this through all these stories, that there's a huge kind of climax in crisis, which gradually gradually eases over time, and the same thing happens here. A few days later, the trawlers started to leave. They started to fish further out, and they started to not be treated in the same way. There were 5 or 6 of the local rioters were arrested, but they were reprimanded and nothing else happened. And again, my feeling is that there's probably some sympathy there. There's, we don't want this to happen. We're not condoning this behaviour, but we understand the desperation that's driven you to this action. And subsequent days in the Harbour Master's logs show that trawlers come and go, but there's never again that same raise of that same climax of emotion takes place. So they must have found some way to work together and ease the tensions. I'm going to stop talking because I see I've gone on longer than usual. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for people saying that they're great stories. They are great stories, and it's a really wonderful collection of records. I hope you can join me next week. I'm looking at an absolutely extraordinary story of Elizabeth McDermott and George Grant. Elizabeth McDermott was what was termed a free black woman in Jamaica, and George Grant was a Highland landowner who went over and started a relationship with her where they had some children. And I will tell you that story and something about the connection that the Highlands have had with the Caribbean slave trade in the past. It's a very moving story and a very interesting story, so I hope you can join me next week for that. A reminder as I go again that this is brought to you by High Life Highland, and there's no cost to the viewer to take part in it. High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no subscription or payment required. But if you are able to donate towards the work of the service, we would very much appreciate that. And thank you everybody for saying that it was interesting. I'm really glad you've enjoyed this week's talk. Thanks.